Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us for this timely discussion of race and gender in politics. We're excited to have you be a part of this conversation, as well as today's panel's discussions throughout the day. So we're looking forward to having everyone talk about their experience through this summit. So thank you so much for joining us throughout the day. And if you're first joining us, I'm Madeline Milcom, President and CEO of APACS, the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. And we are very excited to be hosting the third annual Women's Collective Summit. So thank you for joining us as we get everyone back on to have this discussion. I hope you will put your questions in the chat box here if you're joining us through this platform. And if you're joining us on Facebook, please put your questions in the comments section because we would love to answer those questions throughout this discussion. So as our panelists join us. So thank you for being a part of today's conversation. This has always been something that we wanted to provide as a community for Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander women so that they could have the infrastructure and support to be able to hear from inspiring women who have been able to join in public service, and those who are interested in supporting those women who are looking to be in elected office. So this is a great opportunity. So this is just one of those ways that we hope to overcome some of those challenges and obstacles by having this conversation. So I see that we have Amanda Hunter here from the Barbara Lee Family Foundation joining us. So thank you so much for coming on, Amanda. So, you are over at the Barbara Lee Family Foundation, which, we have had a great partnership since I've joined working with you in trying to discover more attitudes from voters about women representation and women leaders, and specifically with AAPI women and how voters think about AAPI women as candidates, especially for executive office. And so, what are some of the barriers that women face while running that you have found through this work that you've been doing in the research?
Yes, definitely. And we are so grateful for your partnership on a number of projects that we have studied together. We found for more than 20 years that all women face additional barriers, particularly when they seek executive office, because it's one thing for voters to support a woman to be part of a deliberative body like a legislature, but if they really want to recognize a woman as CEO of her city or her state, or maybe even of the country, they need to be that much more convinced that she's up to the job. And it's partially because there are still very entrenched stereotypes in voters' minds about what a leader looks like. We call it an imagination barrier. And one thing that is a very positive development, especially from the last several years, is that the more women that run for office, the more women that serve in office in all levels, actually allows voters to picture it in their minds and breaks down that imagination barrier, reminding voters that women, in fact, are qualified and are capable of being leaders. And we've seen a lot of progress on that front in the past several years.
So the question of electability is still on everyone's minds about whether or not a woman is, qualified, and especially a woman of color. And so, in these, stereotypes, how can we, are there things that we can do to combat those stereotypes, especially when it's related to appearance?
Absolutely. And in one of the projects that we worked on together where we looked at electability, we tested hypothetical women from a number of different backgrounds on both sides of the aisle, including a hypothetical AAPI woman, Republican and Democrat. And each woman won her ballot against a hypothetical white man of the opposite party. So that showed us that the notion that women aren't electable is a tired myth. However, we also found in that research that, and we found it again and again, voters don't assume that women are qualified. So we really recommend that candidates lead with their qualifications. Sometimes it can be tempting to lead with their biography, especially if they have a really great personal story, but just say why you're qualified first. We also recommend using the word qualified. If someone introduces you at a fundraiser, have them say, now I would like to introduce the most qualified woman for the job. You can say it too. Voters need to be reminded of that. And we also know that the top indicators of electability for voters are can handle a crisis, which lately there are plenty of opportunities, unfortunately, for women to demonstrate that they can handle a crisis, and can get results. So women really need to be specific. Talk about metrics and what you've actually accomplished. Use action-oriented language and repeat it over and over. We also know that the economy tends to be a weak spot for all women. There are a lot of gendered stereotypes around women and handling budgets. So emphasize experience that you have managing budgets or an economic plan or something specific to show voters that you are capable of handling money and talking about the economy.
So when we talk about women candidates, and especially women who are running for office for the first time, they may not necessarily always be successful. I think of someone like a Tammy Duckworth, who initially she was not successful in her first run for Congress. What kind of advice do you advise when you think about women who've lost a campaign and are afraid to try again?
That's such a great question. And we studied what happens when women lose a race because we know that women tend to internalize failure. That's very common. And two really quick, cool stories. Our Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, ran for DNC chair in California before she ran for Congress and was devastated when she lost and said that that had been her dream job. And imagine if she had won that race, we may not be where we are today. Same thing with our assistant speaker, Catherine Clark from my home state of Massachusetts. She tells a story about how she ran for a state Senate seat in 2004, lost, and then my boss, Barbara Lee, called her the next day and said, okay, I gave you 1 day to grieve. Now it's time to think about what you're going to do next. And resilience is so important to Barbara. And that's one reason that we looked at this, because women need to pick each other up and remind each other that the failure of a race that you lost is not a reflection on you personally. And the good news is that voters say they don't hold an election loss against a woman. It may not be something that you want to think about right away when you're making a concession speech, but you can start to position yourself to run again as soon as your concession speech. So I always tell staff to keep that in mind when they're drafting a speech. And voters want to see women stay involved in the issues that they ran on in the campaign, stay involved in the community, maybe work with your opponent or hold your opponent accountable, depending on the situation. We also found, which is really interesting, and for women who have run for office before, this is an incredible personal sacrifice. It can be a big financial sacrifice. And so sometimes women have to make tough decisions about taking a job after losing an election. Voters don't like it if a woman takes a high-paying job, which seems pretty judgmental, or teaches at a college or university. So if you make those decisions because they suit you and suit your personal needs best, make sure to highlight work that you're doing in the community at the same time so that you can show voters that you're still doing the work that you committed to during the campaign.
Such great advice. I mean, I think the other issue that we face is continuing to try to keep the women that we have elected so that we can only grow upon that. So in terms of incumbents who are women, what advice do you have for them in this re-election cycle?
Well, we just studied women running as incumbents, and we found that just like voters don't think women are qualified right away, voters also don't assume that women are being effective in their leadership position. So it's very important for incumbent women. And we use this word even for women who are holding one office and maybe running for a higher office. You're still running on your previous record. Make sure that you hammer home your accomplishments, use metrics, be specific, and particularly for AAPI women, voters want to hear you give credit to your team. So voters are specific, and obviously there are very gendered expectations about the way that men can talk about their accomplishments and the way that women can. But it's important for women to show that they are team captains and that they are able to have a great team that is working together. So be sure when you're touting those accomplishments to give credit to your team as well as being specific. And if there are some places where maybe you fell short, especially during the COVID pandemic, not everyone could have their life go according to plan. Voters want you to level with them. Be honest. Have a status update. Don't make any excuses. Don't blame it on COVID. Voters really didn't want to hear that. But say, hey, we haven't finished yet. Here's how far we've gotten. And I'm going to come back to you in 6 months and give you a status report. Voters are feeling really cynical right now on both sides of the aisle about elected leaders. So if they get the sense that you're being honest and respecting them, that's going to go a long way.
So that's some really good news in terms of just, some advice to, provide for incumbents. Interesting to hear more about the, topic of, we versus I, because a lot of times we hear that from male candidates, the I usage instead of saying that we have done this together. And so it really is helpful. And you're also saying specifically that it should be AAPI women who use that word, while as other women can use I and not be judged as harshly.
Right. Voters preferred more we from AAPI women. From women of different backgrounds, it really varied between a combination of both or I. So we know, and one reason that it's so important to do this work is that women from different backgrounds often have to face racial bias on top of gender bias. And this is a prime example. When we first did our first research project in 1998, my boss, Barbara, almost didn't put it out because she didn't want to discourage women. Sometimes it can be very difficult to see the bias that we know is there in black and white in these reports. But she always says that to be forewarned is to be forearmed. And we want to make sure that women have this information so that they know what they're dealing with when they're designing their campaigns.
So the other aspect that we talked about, in gender in terms of, the politics is the likability factor. Can you have a beer with this candidate? And generally they're thinking of a man. So how important is this likability factor in the current environment?
We've found consistently for more than 2 decades that likability is a non-negotiable for women. And certainly likability can be used in a sexist way a lot, especially in the media. But what we know is that voters will vote for a man that they don't like if they believe that he's qualified. I'm sure some of us can think of examples, but they will not do so for a woman. So it is critical for voters to like a woman in order to even consider voting for her. And we also know that likability is so subjective. For a lot of voters, it's an I'll know it when I see it kind of situation. And we really compare it to walking a tightrope because the advice is so subjective. It is dress nicely, but not too fancy. Use humor, but not too much humor. Think closely about the way that you're referring to your team. It's a whole other level of negotiation that men just don't have to think about. We also know that confidence and likability are linked. So if you don't project confidence and voters assess a woman's confidence in less than 30 seconds, then voters may not like you. So it's important to really put your game face on when you're going to a public event or in a debate and project that confidence.
So in a follow-up to confidence, what if someone, says something sexist to you? I know there was a recent work that you've been doing also in regards to how women of color should combat some of that, as well as, how they should do that and the method to which they do that. What sort of advice do you have for that?
Well, this was so interesting for us to look at because I think that there has long been conventional wisdom, even outside of politics, just for all women, that the best approach to handling overt sexism is the strong and silent approach. And we've heard women like Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright tell stories about incredibly sexist things that they dealt with and said nothing. So we were really surprised to find that voters want women to speak out in the face of sexism if voters believe that the incident is severe. So that is where it's subjective for voters. For men, for more conservative voters, and for white voters, they need more evidence that an incident is severe. It's no surprise that the people of color that we polled tended to be more likely to believe that women face sexism because people of color are more likely to face racial bias and understand that people tend to be biased. But overall, it's good news for women that if something happens to you on the campaign trail that you think is important to address, that is in line with your values, voters want to see you stand up for yourself. And even though it can feel really personal to face a sexist attack, for voters, seeing a woman stand up for herself is no different than seeing a woman handle another challenge on the campaign trail, like a tough question from a reporter, or standing up for themselves in a debate about a tough issue that they've been accused of something, or defending themselves that way. So it's important to kind of detach yourself from the taking it personal side, which I know is a challenge sometimes overall in politics, and then think about how can you call this out in a way that is calm and professional, because voters do have preferences about how they want women to call out sexism. I think a really great example of a woman standing up for herself was our Vice President Kamala Harris during her debate, where she said she was speaking, and she was very professional, very calm, moderate tone of voice, but she also held her ground and let Mike Pence know that she was not going to be interrupted. And that is the type of calm and professional response that voters seem to want from women.
Still so fascinating. I always love reading the results of the surveys that we work on, because I just learned so much about what voters are thinking. And you're also surveying people from across the country, not just a particular state. You're doing it across the country. So I'm seeing results from Pennsylvania, Ohio, just a variety of states. And hearing that just makes me really, just seeing that, reading that, just makes me very excited to see that there are places that we may not have a lot of population in terms of AAPI presence, but that doesn't mean that stops us from thinking that AAPI women could be an executive elected office. So thank you for always continuing to work with us. Just wanted to make a note for those people who may not be aware. Unfortunately, right now, Senator Chang is sending her apologies. They're having some power outages in her neighborhood, and so she's having issues getting online. So hopefully we can find another time to feature her. I always enjoy speaking with her, and she has such great advice. And she herself obviously has gone through so many sexist moments in her life. Being a woman of color, being a mom, there's just so many things that have been a double standard where people have judged her unfairly, and her grace in being able to combat these things and overcome these challenges continues to inspire me, and I hope she's able to connect with us in the future. The other issue that I think we would love to hear about is your thoughts, and especially in the work that you do in research, being able to have women representation, and especially in these executive elected offices. How have you seen the change in the years that you've been doing the research?
I think we've seen an exponential shift, especially since the first Women's March in 2017, because the conversation and the culture around women in politics has completely changed. And what we've seen lately, which has been so exciting for us, is that when Barbara started doing this work in the late 90s, women were really still trying to fit into a template based for men. And now women are really running as their authentic selves, and they are sharing experiences that they've personally faced. I mean, I think about Pearl Kim, who I am a huge fan of, who is part of this network, who talked very openly about an assault that she faced. And there are so many examples of women who 20 years ago would have been urged to keep something quiet, whether it was dealing with an illness in a family, or Senator Tammy Baldwin doing an ad about her mother's struggle with addiction, that now women are putting out in the open and explaining to voters how those are the things that motivate them to do this work. And we found in some of our electability research that voters want their leaders to have a strong understanding of the problems that Americans face. So what better way to show voters that you're in touch with their lives than to share some of the personal struggles that you and your family have faced? Barbara always says that women don't run for office to seek fame and fortune. They run to solve problems. And it's true. I bet that a lot of the women at this conference got activated into politics because something affected your family, it affected your community. Maybe you started off just volunteering on a campaign, and then the next thing you know, you're running for office. That's also been a very common trend. We've seen so many women from different professional backgrounds who maybe never even imagined themselves suddenly running for office. And voters really appreciate that authenticity and they connect with it. And I will just offer one other quick caveat around all our research that's important for us to keep in mind is that women can be just as biased as men when it comes to some of these sexist beliefs. And unfortunately, women don't necessarily vote for women automatically either. So it's important as we're navigating stereotypes to keep that in mind. Sometimes women in focus groups can be even harder on women candidates than some of the men, unfortunately. So it's a long struggle to change these stereotypes.
We have an audience question. The question is, should we address sexism from voters differently from against competing candidates? For example, voters asking sexist questions at public events. And if so, how?
That's a great question. And we actually tested in that research a hypothetical situation where two candidates, a man and a woman, in a debate were getting questions, and the woman was asked how she balanced work and family, and the man was not, because unfortunately we know that happens. And in our scenario, we had the woman kind of make a flippant remark and kind of turn it around on the person that asked the question, and voters hated that. So we know that voters actually don't want you to make jokes or be snarky. We always thought maybe you could diffuse something with humor, but they want a serious approach and they want you to connect it to your values. So if a voter said something sexist to you, it probably in some cases doesn't make sense to confront the voter if they're in an audience, but maybe to make a broader statement about, oh, I hear those types of comments all the time, and it's important for me because I know of all the women and girls that are watching to mention how unfair it is and connect it back to the larger values. At the end of the day, voters don't care if your feelings are hurt. They want to know that you're looking for and standing up for women and girls everywhere.
Yeah, I think it just always is an evolution. I mean, I think it took so long for people to understand what a working mom is. You've got single parents who are women who are trying to do, work and, child care and everything else in between. And I think, as we all know, women are not a monolith, and API women also are not. APIs in general are not a monolith either. And so being able to understand, how people view us, going back to your original comment, Amanda, how it's so challenging for us to sometimes absorb the research because this is what voters think of us currently, or how they think of women of color candidates. And, I know that I think about it as like, wow, I really want to share this information and at the same time prepare candidates. Are we enforcing or instilling or reinforcing the stereotypes that people have of us, voters have of us, through their lens, because we're trying to at least meet them to kind of combat some of that? Or do we just, for principle's sake, just, do things differently? And so I think, I always have a little bit of heartburn in those types of situations and trying to figure that out. So it's never easy. And I always think, you still need to be authentic to yourself. So, I think
absolutely.
I
know. Well, I think that's absolutely right. And we always struggle with that as well, because ultimately, I think we all want to change the system. We want to eliminate these stereotypes. And we know that some of this is, if you read our memos, some of it is coded language and some of it is tough to absorb, as you said, and it can be very racist. But we also know that we're not going to be able to change the system if we don't get more women elected to office. And my boss, Barbara Lee, has been doing this work for decades and decades. She is a longtime feminist. She gave out the first copy of Ms. Magazine at her son's first birthday party instead of party favors for the kids. So she knows that structural change is what we are aiming for. But in the meantime, we still need to understand what the barriers are and to be able to work within the existing systems with the goal of affecting eventual change.
Yes, I definitely agree with that. And, that's one of the things that I, mentioned during our trainings is that, we may not like the current system. The system wasn't thinking of us when they built it. And now that we're in the system, or at least trying to break into the system, we can change it from within. So win those elections and then start, creating public policy and, a culture that allows all of our, diverse representative voices to really reflect this democracy in a way that it should. So, greatly appreciate all of your work in at least in empowering us to better understand what voters see when they see us as candidates. So in the chat box, we have the ways that you can connect with Amanda and the Barbara Lee Family Foundation. The work that they do is also linked onto the Apex website. I would say definitely take a look at all of their work. It is so interesting and definitely insightful, and gives a lot of tips on how to prepare yourself as a woman candidate, and also how to work with other women candidates of color, because I think that's also part of the sisterhood of being sure that we're uplifting each other once we're in a position to help one another. So we're gonna conclude this conversation. Thank you so much, Amanda, for joining us. You are our audience participants. You are welcome to go to our event platforms networking feature before the next panel, which starts at 1:55 Eastern. To enter the networking session, please click the networking button on the left-hand side of your screen, and you will be matched with other summit participants for one-on-one video chats. And we hope to meet some of you there. Thank you so much, and we hope to have Senator Chang on at a different time. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.